Never was the saying, "when it rains it pours," more true than in the time of the Great Migrations. Just when the Western Roman Empire looked as if it could stabilize, one catastrophe bigger than the one before happened, a continuous blow of disasters, relentlessly punching into the weakened Eastern and Western Roman empires until one of them would fall. And the appearance of the Huns can be marked as a decisive moment in the fate of the Western Roman Empire, for this storm came at the worst possible time. But this dying Western Empire, in a last effort, managed to defeat this formidable enemy against all odds. How could this be? And was this really a victory? Welcome to this collaboration with Eastern Roman history. This is the second video of a collaborative effort with the excellent channel Eastern Roman History. You can go over to Eastern Roman History to watch the first part, link also in the description, namely how the Eastern Roman Empire dealt with the Huns. I encourage you to also subscribe to Eastern Roman History's channel, for it is one of the most detailed channels about late Roman history. So in the first video we have learned that the Huns had managed to inflict some pretty heavy damage onto the Eastern Roman Empire. They had ravaged the Balkans and inflicted many humiliating defeats onto the Eastern Romans. Many cities were sacked and completely destroyed, such as for example the large city of Naissus, and many Roman soldiers and foederati were killed by the aggressive onslaught of the Huns. The Western Roman Empire in those days, meanwhile, was facing constant civil war and constant barbarian invasions. The year 406 was when it all started going south. In that year, a large coalition of several Germanic nations crossed the frozen river Rhine in winter, and were thus able to establish in the following years their dominions in Gaul and Hispania. The chaos of those years, in combination with the incompetence of the Western Roman Emperor Honorius, allowed these Germanic invaders to establish their own de facto kingdoms. The inability of Honorius to effectively deal with this situation is also what allowed the Visigoths to sack Rome and to establish a kingdom of their own in Aquitania in the following years. Interestingly, this whole situation had started with the Huns, who, when pressing westward from the Asian steppes, forced the Goths to cross the Danube south into Roman territory. And this was when the whole disastrous chain of events was set into motion. So we can say that the Huns were responsible for the sheer extent of Germanic invasions in the first place. Now the West, having had the weaker geography and poorer provinces than the East, consequently had a much harder time to effectively deal with these invasions. On top, constant usurpers and civil wars destroyed most of the Roman forces, and instead of uniting against the barbarians, more than half of the Western Roman army was constantly fighting itself. In the mid-420s, the situation had somewhat stabilized, and in those years Flavius Aetius started rising to power, until in 429 he was made Magister Militum of the West. Now, as so often, what happened was a civil war. The other dominant generals of the Western Empire during those days were Flavius Felix and Bonifatius. The power struggle between those three figures, out of which Aetius emerged victorious, is what ultimately enabled the Vandals to cross the Strait of Gibraltar in 429 and to conquer almost the whole of Africa, including Carthage, in the time span of 10 years. Unfortunately, the appearance of the Huns exactly during those years into the Eastern Empire, when the Vandals conquered Africa, is what would prevent the Romans from retaking Africa and defeating the Vandals. Namely, already in 439, the Eastern and Western Roman empires, in a joint effort under the emperors Valentinian III and Theodosius II, mounted a naval expedition against the Vandals. Both fleets of unknown size and certainly a large contingent of troops were sent to Sicily in that same year. But now the Huns, seeing the withdrawal of large amounts of troops, started their aggressive invasions of the East, so that the project had to be abandoned. It was thus already the first dire consequence of the Hunnic invasion, for which the West had to pay the price, since we know that all later attempts to restore Africa for the Western Roman Empire failed. And please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting our work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. YouTube is a platform that is not really generous to such a niche topic about the late Roman Empire, and the ad revenue from the videos is really low, so in order to be long-term sustainable, I really need your financial support via Patreon or YouTube membership, as embarrassed as I am to say this. But I think Maiorian would thank you for supporting a channel bearing his name, and I certainly do thank each and everyone that supports this channel. Gratias tibiago amici. So the Huns were not only responsible for starting the Great Migration in the first place, which would send many different Germanic nations south and westward, which would directly lead to the defeat at Adrianople and the continuous problems with the Goths and the other Germanic invaders, but no, the Huns were also responsible for the inability of the empire to reclaim Africa for the West. But in 450 now, Attila had enough of attacking the east because he was not able to capture the fortress Constantinople. The massive Theodosian land walls were just too impenetrable, and thus most of the eastern provinces were effectively out of reach for the Huns. Paradoxically though, the Magister Militum Aetius in those days was on good terms with Attila. Aetius had spent some time at the court of Attila in 433, and the Hunnic king even provided Aetius with foederati troops, which Aetius used in order to successfully fight the Visigoths, the Burgundians and the Barcaudai rebels, achieving some major victories in Gallia and Raetia. But these good relations would not last, because let's face it, Attila was just like Genghis Khan, an aggressive invader who was never quite content with what he had and always wanted more. Thus, he decided to invade the West. In 451, he entered Gaul with a large coalition of many different Germanic nations, not only Huns, and proceeded to sack one Gallic city after another. It was now Aetius' duty to defend Gaul against this massive onslaught. Unfortunately, by 451, most of the Western Roman troops, the Comitatenses and Limitanei, were destroyed through decades of constant usurpers and civil wars. Paradoxically, most of the Western Roman army was not destroyed in battles against the barbarian invaders, no, but in constant fights against themselves. Such is the irony of history. So Aetius did not have a lot to work with. Yet still, he managed to gather all the rests of Roman troops whichever he could find, and to muster the remaining strength of the Germanic nations which had settled on the territory of the Western Roman Empire. Among these, the Visigoths hilariously proved to be the ones who would allow the Romans to gain the upper hand against Attila. Yes, the same Visigoths who had sacked Rome 40 years earlier. One Roman city after another fell to the massive Hunnic onslaught. Argentoratum sacked, Augusta Vangionum sacked, Mogontiacum, even the mighty Augusta Treverorum, all sacked, Colonia Agrippina too. Meanwhile, Aetius had managed to convince the Franks, some of the Saxons and some of the Burgundians to join his forces. Thus, finally at Civitas Aureliana, the city that was named after the legendary Aurelian himself, this joint Romano-Germanic alliance relieved the siege of the city and managed to drive the Huns back. Then, on June 20th, 451, finally, one of the greatest and most important battles in the history of the world took place. The Western Romans under Aetius and their Germanic allies faced the Hunnic hordes under Attila at the Catalonian plains, not far from the modern-day city of Chalon. In this incredible battle, the king of the Visigoths, Theodoric I, fell, but the Roman-Germanic alliance was still able to defeat the Huns. Interestingly, Aetius did not choose to completely defeat Attila's forces, even though according to some sources he could have, probably fearing that the Visigoths and the Franks would turn against him in the aftermath, and also possibly because he hoped to make the Huns again foederati to the empire, now that their aura of invincibility was broken. This proved to be a big mistake on part of Aetius, because already 1 year later Attila invaded Italy. Many cities in northern Italy were sacked and Aquileia was destroyed so completely that afterwards the city was only visible as a field of ruins, completely devoid of people. Aetius, with the little forces he had left, tried to stall Attila's advance and harass his troops, but he had just too little men by that point. Most of his Germanic allies had returned to their own dominions. Now legend has it that it was Pope Leo I who met Attila in 452 near the river Po and convinced Attila to withdraw from Italy. This was seen as a sign of divine intervention. In reality though, the Hunnic forces were plagued by disease and malnutrition, since crop failures in Italy in 451 had left the countryside devoid of the ability to produce any provisions. It might well be that Attila had to admit that he lacked the capacity for a further advance south and for a siege of Rome. Then Aetius was harassing them however he could, and Marcian, the Eastern Roman Emperor, had meanwhile sent forces to attack the Hunnic homeland north of the Danube. All these factors probably made Attila realize that a further advance was unrealistic. So he retreated back to the Hunnic heartland, where then, not long afterwards, he died in early 453, either of some sort of disease or having been assassinated. The cause of his death is still being debated to this day. The aftermath of the Hunnic invasions were disastrous for the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, not only were the Huns directly responsible for the great Germanic migrations in the first place, and thus for the utter destabilization of the Roman Empire, and for the settlement of Germanic invaders within its borders, but no, the same Huns were also responsible for preventing the Romans of recapturing Africa from the Vandals and for devastating Gallia and destroying what little of the Roman Comitatenses and Limitanei were still left. The victory of 451 thus was a Pyrrhus victory, where a dying empire apparently won against an overwhelming enemy, but in reality the Western field armies would, through the Hunnic invasions, dissolve even more, until afterwards not much of a Roman army was left at all. The later emperors, such as Maiorianus, had consequently to rely entirely on foederati troops, since no Western Roman army was left, in large part because of the Hunnic invasions. We thus can see that the Huns were a major contributing factor in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Had their invasions not come at the worst possible time, the Western Roman Empire might have recovered. But we can truly say that Attila the Hun, although having been driven back, was the death knell for the Western Roman Empire. Not long later, civil war broke out as so often. Aetius was killed by Valentinian III, the emperor himself not much later, and no emperor was later able to stabilize the Western Roman Empire, not even Majorian. Thus, only 25 years later, the Western Roman Empire dissolved. And if you are interested in what happened during the last days of the Western Roman Empire, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in learning how Rome itself looked during those days, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago amici, and bene valete.